Thanks for tuning in to Reclamation Time Live for news and views on reclamation and reuse. You can join in with a smartphone on X Spaces Live on the second Tuesday every month at 4 p.m. UK time. And this is recorded, downloaded, edited, and then uploaded as a podcast to Apple, Spotify, Spreaker, and other platforms. Hi, I'm Thornton Kay, and today I'm joined by Brian Murphy and Brad Guy as we discuss policies for government and local authorities that might encourage more reclamation and reuse of reclaimed building material.
Have you got the list of encouraging things that the government could do?
I haven't sat down to think about it, but I know that ACAN and Architects Declare have started talking in those terms. Obviously, chasing carbon is kind of one of the big priorities that everyone's talking about.
Read through the list that I've got. For projects that incorporate a certain percentage of reclaimed material, there should be a tax incentive. And there should also be a tax incentive for the stockholders, who are the dealers and social enterprises that stock reclaimed materials. Certainly in the UK, we have estimated that there's probably about 150,000 tonnes of reclaimed material in stock around the UK at any one time. And you want to, roughly multiply that out. Probably in the US there's 1 million tonnes, and probably in Europe there's another 1 million tonnes. So there's a lot of tonnage. The problem with tax incentives is that you could just give an incentive for the salvaging of reclaimed material from demolition. So that's one area. Second area is the actual stocking of the material, which I consider is the most important thing that is done. And that stock is capital tied up. The stock holding, where you can end up with a large quantity of material in stock at any one time, has a value. You have to pay for it, and you have to pay for the area that it's stored in. You have to pay for its processing, the cleaning, the marketing, and then hopefully at the end it's going to sell, and the cost of getting it moved somewhere where it's going to get reused. So all that is something which tax incentives could be applied to. The stock holding, I think, is the most important. But then, if I was, for example, the end user, I might want to be paid for the inconvenience of reusing reclaimed material, as opposed to just being able to go and buy something new.
Yeah, there is a kind of parallel in the energy technology list and the water technology list, where there are government lists of technologies which are energy and water saving. And historically, we used to have enhanced capital allowance if you were to specify materials and products from those lists. It was complicated by the kind of bureaucratic process to get that money deducted from the developer or from the building owner from their tax, because it was being handled by a main contractor who couldn't be bothered with the paperwork. But if there were a process, at least there has been a model in the past of enhanced capital allowance, i.e. reduced tax. Although it's now scrapped, and I don't know what the reason for the scrapping of it, but there has been a model in the past. It might simply have been that nobody was adopting it because the paperwork was so unwieldy that nobody bothered to deal with it. And they decided to scrap the enhanced capital allowance part of it, but the energy technology list is still there. There might be a kind of room for kind of persuading government to think about an enhanced capital allowance for reclaimed materials. But it sounds a little bit tortuous to kind of join those parts up, but it's worth asking the question.
Yes,
I can hear you, Brad. Okay.
Yeah, we're getting some kind of hiss. I don't know why.
Yeah,
I think it could be my fan.
You've got your family. Great. How are you?
Fine. I'm in a very hot place.
Yeah, so we were just talking about, with this election having just been taking place here, the American is Brad Guy from Florida, who's written books, taught, been a professor and generally, and he's also been, I think I'm right in saying, president of the Used Building Materials Association way back in about 30 years ago. And he's a grandfather of reclamation in the USA. So, Brad, what we're doing is talking about things which we could ask the incoming UK and any other government policies to adopt to increase the amount of reclamation and reuse. And we're just talking about the first topic was tax incentives, and that's tax incentives for projects that incorporate reclaimed materials, but also tax incentives for reclaiming material, deconstructing buildings, reclaiming from demolition, and also incentives for creating storage areas where material can be stored either temporarily or permanently as in a social enterprise or a non-profit or commercial reclaiming business, and temporarily as a decanting area for inner city demolitions and deconstructions, where you quite often don't have the room to stash stuff. And
there are some things happening in the U.S., but some of them I think probably you must have, because I think they're pretty general. Do you have rehabilitation tax credits? So for any existing buildings, you have these.
Yeah, like VAT.
Okay, and then so that's sort of a reuse in place. Do you have tax credits for, in the U.S., almost every state has a tax exemption for the purchase of any kind of equipment used in recycling or manufacturing of recycled content products. So that would probably be an easy one to stretch to anything you purchase to facilitate deconstruction or reuse, because it's already well established for any capital equipment for recycling. Do you have anything like that?
The capital allowances rather, that you get, you can, if it depends how much the equipment is. If it's not very much, you just run it through as part of your operating costs, and that would be fully allowable against your tax. If it's something that's expensive, like $20,000 or pounds, then you'd be expected to only write off a percentage. You can write it all down, but it takes a few years to do it. So, yes, we don't have that in the UK.
Another one that's now currently going on is we have green banks in the U.S. that have been funded by the federal government. And a green bank is a quasi-public private partnership that is not allowed to make a profit, basically, because it's subsidized by the government, but it's a bank. So the loans that the bank makes are not allowed to have interest, or else the interest is no more than literally the operating cost of the bank. There's no allowance for profit. So what you can end up with is a zero interest loan, a forgivable loan, or some ridiculously low interest like 1%. And I don't know where this can help in one way, but for the current legislation, the purchase of low carbon, and so some of it's for energy efficiency and upgrades, but Scope 3 emissions are also allowable. So if you were doing an improvement or building a new building, the purchase of your materials, which would be qualified as low carbon, would qualify for the loans through this green bank at zero interest.
So what you're talking about is the construction end of things. It's not the actual stockholding dealer.
No, it's the purchase.
Brad, can I just run through? I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points in addition to this tax incentives. I'll just run through each of them, and then perhaps we could just talk about each of them for a short time. So the second is the mandatory disclosure of reused material content in new buildings. New buildings is going to be very little, but the average is 1%, 2% in Europe and the UK. Building codes that allow more flexibility, right, in the reuse of reclaimed material, and that could be a moot point because certainly mainstream construction, which is 98% of the building material, they might say, well, no, they can't. They're not going to be allowed to put inferior products through and get a tax credit or whatever. Third point is public procurement policies that give a preference to projects incorporating reclaimed building material. Fourth point is R&D funding for technologies to assess and certify the properties of reclaimed. So coming back to the first one, mandatory disclosure of reused building material content in new build or refurbishment retrofit. Mandatory meaning it's either going to be a declaration or it would have to be an inspection by some external agency who's going to verify that amount of stuff. Personally, I always prefer a declaration to an inspector, but then you could argue that you'll get away with more with an inspector. Right. A declaration.
So I know in Washington, D.C. and New York City, they now have mandatory disclosure of your energy use intensity at the point of sale. So it's where and when you do these kind of audits. And the best point is any kind of transfer, right? You can't just go around saying, oh, well, we're going to audit every building that exists. There's kind of a point of sale, which makes kind of a good common sense point when the disclosure is basically for the purchaser. The point of that is the kind of label of the efficiency for what, it's what you're buying. It's how efficient is it? What is the quote benefit? What is the point you're trying to clarify?
It would make sense for these various standards that exist, like LEED and BREEAM and these other ones, to have in my view anyway, to have some kind of minimum reclamation and reuse, and that could be done as a sort of declaration, because it would encourage more reuse. So let's say the minimum should be the national average of 1 or 2%, and a good green building should have maybe 5%.
Sure. Well, you might be aware of the deposit programs in California. So at the permit stage, you have to, it's basically a tax that you get rebated or a fee. So you actually pay an additional fee at the beginning of the project based on an estimation, you will get your money back. So that's maybe another kind of tax idea. It's, a salvo approved or whatever way you like it, reclamation business, because they have verified that it is in fact a reclaimed product. Somebody had to say it was really a reclaimed product. And so the verification is that I did buy it from a legitimate supplier of those materials.
A while back we had a thing called the carbon reduction commitment, and that was where you would declare at the beginning of a financial year how much carbon you would be using, and you would pay an amount of tax, I think in advance. I'm not quite sure how that works, but at the end of the year, if you've managed to reduce your carbon consumption, then you could reclaim some of that money. So there was an incentive for people to kind of engage robustly. Whether you could apply the same principles, I don't know, but that eventually was regarded as a tax rather than an incentive, and so it kind of put people off. And I heard subsequently that people don't like being taxed; they'd much rather be fined. And if there's something in that, I don't know whether there is, but if that's the case, you find some. And Belgium, the Belgian government, when life cycle assessment was in its youth in 2012, the Belgian government decided they were going to tax people based on life cycle assessments of their building design, then if there was any substitution that happened, which inevitably happens in construction, then the difference had to be accounted for and dealt with in a robust way. And a combination of those things, there might be something to kind of suggest to government and see if they could kind of come to grips with it. If you want people to engage in the circular economy, I don't know whether the government do or not, if they want it, it's got to be supported and it's got to be helped along the way through whatever mechanisms you can. So, they just need to be reminded that we've got a materials crisis that's coming, and that we've got to kind of try and deal with it as best we can now.
I think we have to assume that all governments across North America, Europe, and in other places have bought into the circular economy. What they actually mean by that is probably different in different places, and different parts of mainstream construction will talk differently about it. But one assumes that most countries now are taking at least paying lip service to the circular economy, and by that they don't mean the circular economy being the linear economy with a little bit of recycling at the end. They actually mean an entirely circular economy where things get reused over and over again.
There's a 1 cent tax on tobacco or whatever, because we know all these thousands of people are going to die, and so we need to do an account for the loss of life and healthcare costs to society. I don't know that people see those taxes, so that's why maybe it works. You just say, well, this is the cost, and it's 5 cents more. We have plastic bag taxes now everywhere, and so if you bring a bag, you don't pay the 5 cent tax, but if you want a plastic bag, you have to pay for it. And people, I think, have gotten they just, it just becomes the norm, basically.
Yeah. Can I just say that I think that Brian's idea about fining is probably true, and Brad, you're going along with that as well. So in other words, if you have you're putting up a building, and the rules say you've got to use 2% reclaimed. And at the end of it, and if you don't use 2% reclaimed, you're going to get fined $10,000 or whatever it is.
But that's nothing. They're like,
yeah, exactly. It's nothing. It's nothing. You're exactly right, and that's why I'm not too sure about fining. I think it's the carrot and stick thing, and I just don't think the sticks are really. To me, it doesn't seem the right way of doing it.
And in the UK, we now have QSs, quantity surveyors, the cost controller people, who tell you, spend your money on this, don't spend it on that, because this is where you're getting your cheapest points. And they know exactly where, all of those cheap solutions are. So, they just get into the habit of bad habits.
So, the mandatory disclosure of reused building material content in new buildings, that could work, but the penalty, we don't know what the incentives or penalties should be.
So can I ask, what about, I came across a website lately that was dedicated to, quote, green homes. So it's like a real estate listing website. You might go on Trulia or one of the other, you want to find a home to buy or something. But it was only for green, quote, homes. And I'm just wondering about, you said carrot and stick, so, and often things are done incrementally, right? First you kind of ask people and then you tell them. So if you say, well, what about a listing or a reference system, which is the buildings which are greener or have reclaimed material or lower carbon or whatever, that's a preference at the early stage versus the requirement, because they'll often say, or whoever it is, well, we're not ready for a mandatory. We need to get people more accustomed.
You say that, but it's possible that a voluntary system might work. If, for example, you aim for the top end, where you've got seriously large developers or people who are doing big projects, ESG will come into play, investment will come into play, and they may have rules and regulations that they impose for environmental reasons, which do get carried. They've already got checks and balances and ways of making sure those things do happen, and there's less chance of people just cheating blatantly, because there's actually at that kind of level, some companies have got genuine concerns about the environment that they're trying to show that their company is serious at tackling. So, a declaration system in that situation might work, because if they're found out to be cheating, the consequences would affect their stock price or whatever.
And then you phase in, you have to have some minimum threshold.
Well,
where am I going to get the reclaimed material? You're requiring me to have reclaimed material.
Yeah, okay.
And there's not enough of it, and I can't get it,
right.
and it costs too much, and no one knows where it is, and blah, blah, blah.
All right. We're also in training here, Brad, with getting a guaranteed continuity of supply. So that we're going to deal with that as well, but not in this particular thing. This is to try and get the. But I can take your point that it's all part and parcel of the same thing. But I've got a different project that I'm working on now, on a large scale reclamation and reuse. So, but let's leave this mandatory disclosure one. Going on to building codes that allow for more flexibility in the reuse of reclaimed material. Is there such a thing? I just wonder whether that is a real thing, or I'm just making it up and it's never ever going to work.
So there's 3 states in the U.S. that currently have default wood grading, number 2 grade, which is the kind of for wood frame construction structurally, and they allow a default grade of undamaged reclaimed lumber. so you do not need to regrade it. And that's Washington, Oregon, and New York State. I know you have obviously more masonry and concrete and brick in Europe, but and as you know, that's very political when you have the interest of people who make all the new equivalents.
We've got a similar thing over here just going on in steel at the moment, and so steel is being reused in London in some major buildings, and what they do is they take the old steelwork, which is probably not that old, 10 years, 20 years, and they take it apart carefully. They then send it off to be refurbished and tested so that it conforms to the current of the standards. Next point, public procurement policies that give preference to projects incorporating the reuse of reclaimed building material. Now, Brian, there's this thing called the Inflation Reduction Act in the USA, which could get the kibosh from Donald Trump, but as long as Biden's in charge, they are throwing money at people who public procurement, trying to make it greener. And one of the aspects of it being greener is that they want to reuse more. And Brad's on the case on that. So that are they actually talking about, Brad? Are they talking about subsidising procurement so that if you use reclaimed material, you're going to get more help from the Inflation Reduction Act funds?
So in the beginning of this process, the funding that for the development of more APDs and the carbon labeling, National Carbon Labeling Program, awarded the main federal agencies their own pots of money to buy low carbon material. They sort of call it a pilot approach. So, for example, I don't know, pick an agency like Department of Defense or the U.S. Department of Transportation. They got billions of dollars as grants to spend on the low carbon whatever projects they might have coming up. I read about, I think it's either New Jersey or New York is thinking about legislation for public procurement by the state government that would tack on a kind of automatic 5% premium if the products qualify through the EPD or the low carbon label. So that would be a public procurement policy that just automatically says, until whatever time they stop doing it, but from the beginning, it's kind of like when you qualify the cost basis, right? The cost basis plus whatever quality aspects you want. You may not always go for the lowest bidder because you realize you need certain specific items. And so they're just adding 5% for low carbon material.
Yeah, I don't understand what the 5% exactly does.
It's to buy low carbon material on top of what it would cost ordinarily.
So the federal government is going to provide a subsidy for the use of reclaimed building material of 5%.
These are two state governments.
Oh, right. Okay. So that's a policy which is not mandatory. That's voluntarily on the state governments. Yeah.
Well, no. So you're not required to buy the low carbon material, but you will.
No, I mean the 5% subsidy.
Right. So the government is just saying we're going to set aside 5% more for procurement of low carbon material.
When you say government, that sounds like the federal government.
The state government.
State government. Okay, got it. And how many states do that?
Well, right now I'm only aware of a couple, but I know people are keeping the list better than I am of policy changes. It's a very rapid landscape. The Buy Clean programs that have established are rapidly increasing.
Sorry, what was it? What's it called?
Buy Clean.
Buy Clean.
Clean, like, dirty coal or clean something.
Clean. Buy Clean. Got it. Okay. Well, I can look at it. The next thing we got here that might improve things is R&D, research and development funding, for technologies to assess and certify properties of reclaimed materials. And I suppose I'm thinking of the things like material passports and EPDs and that sort of thing. I mean, I'm always a bit skeptical about all those sorts of things, but every day practically I'm invited to attend a webinar on material passports, and the problem is that EPDs and material passports, as far as I can see, are essentially for trying to compare one new product with another new product, and not for, they don't really help when it comes to reclaimed material, and there's, it seems to me, insuperable obstructions to being able to make that comparison with a like-for-like document. An EPD for reclaimed material, unless it's recently manufactured, recently produced, so it's like a 5-year-old, and it's had an EPD when it was installed in a building, then that's different. But I'm talking about a 100-year-old brick isn't going to have an EPD because it won't have. There are various aspects of it that are not. The information is not collected in a way in which you can have a meaningful EPD. And I would have thought the same thing applies to material passports. They are now for the future. If you're building a new building now, you use new material, all of it certified, and that information travels with that building. And in 30 years' time, it's demolished. You've got all the information to be able to have the material passport handed over to the new owner, developer. But it doesn't go backwards in time, the material passport. And so, if you like, it's a bit like design for deconstruction in that it's crystal ball gazing, and it because we don't know what life's going to be like in 30 years' time. And it's kicking the elephant in the room down the road, which is, what do you do with all the buildings that are being demolished today? And it's not saving more materials from buildings today. It's making it harder to save material from buildings today. So that's my feeling about material passports, and I'm not too sure. I looked quite carefully at I did find a brick, an EPD of reclaimed bricks, which wasn't about the packaging of the bricks, which was the one I'd seen before in Denmark from several years ago. This is a new one on actually reclaimed bricks. But when I looked at it more carefully, the company that was that had paid for this EPD to be done, Norwegian company, they were a company that sold green roofing material, and they did sell some crushed brick mixed in with soil for some purpose or another, but they weren't selling reclaimed bricks. And so I still haven't found an EPD which covers reclaimed bricks for sale for reuse as bricks. So the R&D funding, if we can have the technologies, in my view, what we need there to encourage the reuse of reclaimed materials is measuring stock holdings, quarterly measurements of stock holdings in a country or in a state, to inform the regulatory authorities whether the amount that's being reclaimed or reused is going up or going down, what sort of materials are working, what sort of materials aren't working, or whatever. And so methods of measuring, like using AI and drones and satellite views and whatever, algorithms, so that you can get a snapshot very easily of what's going on. At the moment, the only people I know who've done any kind of snapshot, and you can hardly call it a snapshot. If you recall, you remember those Victorian photographers they would open the shutter and it would take several hours to get. That's the kind of level we're at the moment in taking snapshots of the salvage trade. And both Brad, just so you know, Brad is very familiar with that because he's done it himself, and we're very familiar as well because we've also done it here. So, snapshots are so important. So that would be my view, is that they should invest in a mechanism. So it's not just the nuts and bolts of how you can do that carry out that operation on a regular basis. It's also ways of persuading the trade that it's in their interest for them to do that, because they're going to have to cooperate. And if they knew that somehow the tax incentives that we first talked about here would be easier for them to get if they cooperated with the measurement system, then maybe that would work.
So the question here is, and I don't follow this because, it's too much, but architectural firms in the U.S., there was a lot of controversy over being able to take research as a tax deduction, business expense. So do you have any kinds of tax, business expense deduction? So basically you can reduce your tax burden based on for your research.
Yeah, we do. R&D is you can write off R&D in Britain. I don't know about Europe, and I don't know. The government changes that quite frequently, but as far as I'm aware, that's still a thing where you can actually write off R&D costs, and they're relatively low bar proof-wise. The proof of whether that really was R&D or whether it's did you achieve anything, that sort of thing.
Apparently architects are doing it in droves. One thing I have heard very recently was that there's an awful lot of companies who are now being challenged by the Inland Revenue to pay back the money because it wasn't legitimate. So they've gone through all this process, done the work, and then find themselves with an enormous tax burden.
Is that R&D?
Is
that R&D?
Yes, absolutely.
So the next question is, obviously that's a loss of revenue to the government. And so for example, with environmental producer responsibility laws, those are again a tax of, future management of the product. So like e-waste type taxes. And that becomes a fee that goes into a revenue pot that unfortunately might have flexibility, but some of that can be, we need to use this to develop better, end of life or whatever you want to spend it on to solve the problem.
Under the Westway, an elevated section of motorway, and a storage yard, we almost succeeded, failed at the last hurdle.
But it was feasible.
Yeah. And that piece of land, as far as I know, is still available. That's definitely a good idea, I think. Because all cities have got elevated roads. The only thing that I used to think about that was it's not a very healthy environment. If you're going to have somebody who's looking after it, it's not a very healthy environment to work in.
That's true.
But with the advent of low emission zones and electric cars and stuff like that, it becomes a lot healthier.
And maybe just you have to have protocols, unfortunately, for dose times duration. You can have a dose, but you don't want a long dose.
Okay, that's it.
Thank you both. See you soon.